The wind howled across the frozen plains like the cry of wounded spirits, carrying with it the bitter promise of another harsh winter. Standing Wolf pressed his weathered hands against the small window of his cabin, watching the snow fall in thick, heavy flakes that seemed to mock his desperate prayers. Behind him, on a bed made of buffalo hides and woolen blankets, his 7-year-old daughter, Little Dove, lay burning with fever. For 3 days now, the child had been consumed by an illness that no traditional remedy could touch. Her small body shook with violent chills one moment and burned like fire the next. Standing Wolf had tried everything his grandmother had taught him about healing. He had brewed teas from willow bark and echinacea, created poultices from sage and cedar, and even performed the sacred healing ceremonies his father had passed down through generations of Lakota tradition. Nothing worked. If anything, Little Dove seemed to be slipping further away from him with each passing hour. Standing Wolf was known throughout the reservation as one of the most skilled hunters and trackers. His ability to read the land, to understand the language of wind and weather, had kept his small family fed even during the harshest winters. But all his knowledge of the natural world meant nothing when faced with his daughter's mysterious illness. He felt powerless, broken, watching the only family he had left slowly fade away. His wife, Singing Bird, had died 2 winters ago during childbirth, taking their unborn son with her. Since then, it had been just Standing Wolf and Little Dove against the world. The child was everything to him, his reason for waking each morning, his motivation to hunt and provide, his connection to hope in a world that often seemed determined to crush the spirit of his people. The reservation clinic was 30 miles away, and the old pickup truck he relied on had broken down 3 weeks ago. Even if he could somehow get there, he had no money for medicine or treatment. The government checks that were supposed to come regularly were often late or smaller than promised. Standing Wolf had sold everything of value he owned just to buy food and heating oil for the winter. As he watched the storm intensify outside, desperation began to claw at his chest like a living thing. He had always been a practical man, someone who solved problems through action and determination. But now he felt trapped, helpless, watching his child suffer while the world outside grew more hostile and unforgiving. Little Dove stirred on the bed, calling out weakly for water. Standing Wolf hurried to her side, lifting her small head gently and helping her sip from a wooden cup. Her skin felt like hot coals against his calloused hands. Her usually bright brown eyes were glazed and unfocused, and when she looked at him, he wasn't sure she recognized her own father. "Papa," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I'm so cold." Standing Wolf pulled another blanket over her slight frame, though he knew the cold she felt came from within, not from the winter air. He smoothed her long black hair away from her feverish forehead and began to sing one of the old songs his mother had sung to him when he was sick as a child. His voice was rough with emotion, but he hoped the familiar melody might bring her some comfort. The cabin felt smaller than ever as the storm raged outside. Built by his grandfather decades ago, it had weathered many harsh winters, but tonight it seemed fragile against the forces of nature. The single room served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom all at once. A wood-burning stove provided heat, but Standing Wolf was running low on firewood. He would need to venture out soon to gather more, but he couldn't bear to leave Little Dove alone, even for a short time. On the rough wooden table near the window sat a framed photograph of Singing Bird holding infant Little Dove. Standing Wolf's eyes lingered on his wife's gentle face, and he felt the familiar ache of loss mixed with his current fear. Singing Bird had been the practical one, the one who always seemed to know what to do in difficult situations. She would have found a way to help their daughter. He was certain of it, but Standing Wolf was alone now, and his usual confidence had been shattered by his inability to heal the most important person in his world. He had tracked wounded animals for miles through blizzards, had survived weeks in the wilderness with nothing but his wits and traditional knowledge, had provided for his family through economic hardships that would have broken many men. Yet here he sat, completely powerless against a child's fever. As the night deepened and the storm showed no signs of abating, Standing Wolf made a decision that went against every instinct he had developed over 35 years of life. He would have to venture out into the blizzard and try to reach the clinic on foot. It was probably a suicide mission. The temperature was well below zero and visibility was almost non-existent. But staying here and watching Little Dove grow weaker was a form of torture he could no longer endure. He began gathering supplies for the journey, knowing he would need to travel light but also needed to be prepared for the worst. A small backpack, some dried meat, matches wrapped in waterproof material, a knife and his grandfather's compass. He would wrap Little Dove in every blanket he owned and carry her with him. It was dangerous beyond measure, but it was the only chance they had. As he prepared for what might be their final journey together, Standing Wolf whispered a prayer to his ancestors, asking for strength and guidance. The wind seemed to answer with an even more ferocious howl, as if the spirits themselves were warning him against this desperate plan. But desperation had become his only companion, and he was willing to risk everything for even the smallest chance of saving his daughter's life. Standing Wolf wrapped Little Dove in layers of blankets until she looked like a small bundle in his arms. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and he could feel the heat radiating from her body even through the thick coverings. The storm outside had not lessened, and through the small window, he could see nothing but a wall of swirling white snow. Taking a deep breath, he opened the cabin door and stepped into the brutal winter night. The wind hit him like a physical blow, nearly knocking him backward. Snow stung his face like thousands of tiny needles, and within seconds his exposed skin began to ache from the cold. The temperature had to be at least 20 degrees below zero, and the wind made it feel even colder. Standing Wolf had been in many blizzards before, but carrying his sick child made everything different. Each step required enormous effort as his boots sank deep into the snowdrifts. The familiar landmarks that usually guided him across the reservation were completely hidden by the storm. Even the road was impossible to distinguish from the surrounding landscape. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Standing Wolf realized he was already in serious trouble. His legs were burning with exhaustion from fighting through the deep snow, and he could no longer feel his hands despite his thick gloves. Worse, he was no longer certain he was heading in the right direction. The compass was difficult to read in the darkness and blowing snow, and he was beginning to suspect he might be walking in circles. Little Dove had stopped responding to his voice entirely. Her small body felt limp in his arms, and the terrible thought crossed his mind that he might already be too late. The weight of her bundled form, which had seemed manageable at first, was becoming increasingly difficult to manage as his strength faded. The rational part of his mind began arguing that they should turn back while they still could. At least the cabin offered shelter and warmth. But when he turned to look behind him, Standing Wolf realized with growing horror that his footprints had already been filled in by the blowing snow. He was no longer sure which direction led back to safety. Panic began to creep into his chest, but Standing Wolf forced himself to remain calm. Panic killed people in situations like this. He needed to think clearly, to use all his survival skills to find shelter until the storm passed. But as he looked around, all he could see in every direction was an endless expanse of white. His grandfather had taught him that the land would always provide for those who knew how to read its signs. But tonight, the land seemed determined to claim both him and his daughter. The wind was so loud that he couldn't hear anything else, and the snow was falling so heavily that he could barely see his own feet. Standing Wolf pressed forward, hoping that if he could just keep moving, he might stumble upon some form of shelter or recognize some landmark that would guide him to safety. But with each step he felt his energy draining away. His legs were becoming heavy, and his breathing was labored from the effort of fighting through the snow while carrying Little Dove. Then, without warning, the ground beneath his feet gave way. Standing Wolf found himself tumbling down a steep embankment, his arms instinctively protecting Little Dove as they rolled through the snow. They came to rest at the bottom of what felt like a small ravine, both of them partially buried in a drift that had caught their fall. Standing Wolf struggled to sit up, his entire body aching from the tumble. Little Dove was still in his arms, and he was relieved to hear her breathing, though it sounded even more labored than before. The fall had disoriented him completely, and now he truly had no idea which direction they had been traveling. The ravine offered some protection from the wind, but it also meant they were even more lost than before. Standing Wolf realized with growing dread that they might not survive the night. His wet clothes were beginning to freeze against his skin, and he could feel hypothermia starting to set in. His thoughts were becoming slower, and he was having difficulty concentrating. As he sat in the snowdrift, holding his dying daughter. Standing Wolf felt the last of his hope beginning to slip away. This was how it would end, he thought. Not in glorious battle or peaceful old age, but here in a nameless ravine, defeated by weather and circumstance. He had failed as a father, failed as a provider, failed as a man. The wind continued to howl above them, and snow continued to fall steadily into the ravine. Standing Wolf knew that if they stayed here much longer, they would both be buried alive. But he no longer had the strength to climb out, and even if he could, he had no idea where to go. He began to sing softly to Little Dove, the same lullabies Singing Bird had sung to her as a baby. His voice was weak and hoarse, but the familiar words brought him some small comfort. If these were to be their final moments together, he wanted them to be filled with love rather than fear. As exhaustion began to overcome him, Standing Wolf felt his eyes growing heavy. He knew that falling asleep in these conditions meant death, but his body was no longer entirely under his control. The cold was seeping into his bones, and the weight of Little Dove in his arms felt both precious and impossibly heavy. Just as consciousness began to slip away from him, Standing Wolf thought he heard something different in the wind. Not the usual howling, but something that almost sounded like a voice calling out through the storm. He tried to listen more carefully, but his mind was becoming foggy, and he wasn't sure if he was imagining things. The sound came again, definitely a human voice, though he couldn't make out the words. With enormous effort, Standing Wolf managed to call out in response, though his voice was barely audible above the wind. He called again, louder this time, putting everything he had left into the effort. Then, incredibly, he saw a light moving through the snow above the ravine. Someone was out there, someone who might be able to help them. Standing Wolf tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him. All he could do was continue calling out, hoping desperately that whoever was up there would hear him and find them before it was too late. The light stopped moving above the ravine, and Standing Wolf heard a woman's voice calling down to him through the storm. The words were difficult to make out over the wind, but the tone was urgent and concerned. He managed to call back, his voice cracking with exhaustion and cold. "Down here. Please, my daughter needs help." Within moments, he could hear movement at the edge of the ravine, and then someone was sliding down the snowy slope toward them. The light grew brighter as the figure approached, and Standing Wolf could finally see that it was indeed a woman, wearing heavy winter clothes and carrying what appeared to be a powerful flashlight. She was younger than he had expected from her voice, perhaps in her early 30s, with short brown hair visible beneath a knit cap. Her face was flushed from the cold, but her eyes were sharp and focused as she quickly assessed the situation. She immediately knelt beside them in the snow, her attention going first to Little Dove. "How long has she been like this?" the woman asked, gently touching the child's forehead with a gloved hand. Her voice carried an accent that Standing Wolf couldn't quite place, but her English was clear and confident. 3 days with fever," Standing Wolf replied, struggling to form the words clearly. "Getting worse. Tried to reach clinic." The woman nodded grimly as she examined Little Dove more closely. "She's burning up and her breathing is very shallow. We need to get both of you somewhere warm immediately." She looked up at Standing Wolf with concerned eyes. "Can you walk if I help you?" Standing Wolf tried to stand, but found his legs wouldn't support him properly. The combination of exhaustion, cold, and desperation had taken a greater toll than he had realized. "I don't think so," he admitted, hating to show weakness but knowing their survival might depend on honesty. "Okay, don't worry," the woman said, her voice calm and reassuring. "My truck is just up the hill. I'm going to help you get out of this ravine, but I need you to stay conscious and help me as much as you can." "What's your name?" "Standing Wolf, this is Little Dove, my daughter." "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she replied, already working to help him to his feet. "I'm a nurse, and I promise you we're going to take care of your daughter." The climb out of the ravine was one of the most difficult things Standing Wolf had ever done. Sarah proved to be stronger than her modest size suggested, and she seemed to know exactly how to support him while he carried Little Dove. She had brought a rope with her, which she secured around his waist to help pull them up the steep slope. At the top of the ravine, Standing Wolf could see Sarah's truck parked nearby, its headlights cutting through the swirling snow. It was a heavy-duty pickup with snow tires and what looked like medical equipment in the back. Sarah quickly helped them to the vehicle and got them inside where the heater was running full blast. The warmth hit Standing Wolf like a wave, and he realized just how close they had come to freezing to death. Sarah immediately began examining little Dove more thoroughly. Using a small medical bag she pulled from behind the driver's seat, she took the child's temperature and pulse, listened to her breathing, and checked her eyes with a small flashlight. "Her temperature is 104 degrees, Sarah said grimly. "That's dangerously high. We need to get her to a hospital right away." She looked at Standing Wolf with serious eyes. "The reservation clinic isn't equipped for this kind of emergency. I'm going to drive you to Regional Medical Center in town. It's about 40 miles, but they'll have everything she needs." Standing Wolf wanted to object about the cost, about his lack of insurance, about all the practical problems that stood between his daughter and proper medical care, but Sarah seemed to read his thoughts. "Don't worry about any of that right now," she said firmly. "The only thing that matters is getting little Dove the help she needs. We'll figure out everything else later." As Sarah started the truck and began the careful journey through the storm, she explained that she was a traveling nurse who worked with rural communities. She had been driving back from a house call when she saw Standing Wolf's tracks leading away from the road and disappearing into the storm. Something had told her to investigate, especially when she realized the tracks included those of someone carrying a heavy burden. "I've lived in this area for 5 years," she said as she navigated the treacherous roads. "I know these storms can be deadly, and I couldn't just drive by without checking. Thank God I listened to my instincts." Standing Wolf watched his daughter's face in the dim light from the dashboard. Little Dove seemed peaceful now, no longer tossing and turning with fever, but he wasn't sure if that was a good sign or a bad one. Sarah must have noticed his worried expression. "She's stable for now," Sarah assured him. Getting her out of the cold and into the warm truck was the first step. The hospital will be able to bring her fever down and figure out what's causing it. Children are resilient, much more than adults sometimes. The drive seemed to take forever as they crept along snow-covered roads that were barely visible in the storm. Several times Sarah had to stop and dig the truck out of snowdrifts, but she never complained or showed any sign of frustration. She seemed completely focused on getting them to safety. Standing Wolf found himself studying this remarkable woman who had appeared out of nowhere to save them. Sarah Mitchell was clearly someone accustomed to dealing with emergencies, but there was something more than professional competence in her actions. She seemed genuinely concerned about people she had never met before, willing to risk her own safety to help strangers in need. "Why?" Standing Wolf asked quietly, as they finally saw the lights of the town appearing through the storm. "Why did you stop? Most people would have kept driving." Sarah was quiet for a moment, concentrating on the road. "I have a daughter too," she finally said. "She's 8 years old, living with her father back east. If she were in trouble and I couldn't be there to help her, I would hope someone like you would have someone like me appear when they needed it most." The simple honesty of her answer touched something deep in Standing Wolf's chest. This woman understood what it meant to love a child with complete and desperate intensity. She knew the fear that was tearing him apart inside, and she had acted on that understanding without hesitation. As they pulled into the hospital parking lot, Standing Wolf realized that something fundamental had changed in the last few hours. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. The emergency room erupted into controlled chaos the moment Sarah carried little Dove through the automatic doors. She had called ahead during the drive, so medical staff were already waiting with a gurney and equipment. Standing Wolf watched helplessly as nurses and doctors immediately surrounded his daughter, taking her vital signs and asking rapid questions that Sarah answered with professional efficiency. 7-year-old female, temperature 104.2, unconscious, labored breathing, Sarah reported to the attending physician. 3 days of progressive fever. No response to traditional remedies. Father reports no recent travel or known exposure to infectious diseases. Standing Wolf tried to follow as they wheeled little Dove toward an examination room, but a kind but firm nurse guided him to a registration desk instead. The questions came at him in a blur. Insurance information, emergency contacts, medical history, consent forms. He struggled to answer, partly because his mind was still foggy from cold and exhaustion, but mostly because his attention was focused entirely on the treatment room where his daughter had disappeared. Sarah appeared at his side during the registration process, helping him navigate questions he didn't understand, and providing information about their emergency transport. When the registration clerk asked about payment arrangements, Sarah quietly handed over her own credit card. "I can't let you do that," Standing Wolf protested, but Sarah waved away his objections. "We'll figure it out later," she said firmly. Right now, the only thing that matters is little Dove getting better. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Dr. Rebecca Chen emerged from the examination room and approached them. She was a petite Asian woman with tired eyes but a confident manner that immediately inspired trust. "Your daughter is very sick," Dr. Chen said without preamble.
She has pneumonia in both lungs, which explains the high fever and difficulty breathing.
The good news is that we caught it before it became life-threatening, and pneumonia is very treatable with the right antibiotics. Standing, Wolf felt his knees nearly buckle with relief. "She's going to be okay?" "She's going to be fine," Dr. Chen assured him. "But she needs to stay in the hospital for several days while we treat the infection and make sure her fever comes down completely. We've already started her on IV antibiotics and she's responding well." The doctor explained that little Dove would be moved to a pediatric room where Standing Wolf could stay with her. The pneumonia was likely caused by a bacterial infection that had been complicated by the stress of poor nutrition and inadequate heating in their cabin. It was a common problem in rural areas during harsh winters, especially among families without access to regular medical care. "Can I see her now?" Standing Wolf asked. "Of course. She's still unconscious, but that's normal given her condition and the medication we've given her. The important thing is that her fever is already starting to come down." When Standing Wolf entered Little Dove's room, he was amazed by the transformation. His daughter was connected to several monitors that beeped softly. An IV line was delivering medication into her small arm, and her breathing already seemed easier. But most importantly, her face looked peaceful instead of tortured by fever. Sarah had followed him into the room and stood quietly in the corner, giving father and daughter privacy while still being available if needed. Standing Wolf sat in the chair beside the bed and gently took Little Dove's hand in his own. Her skin still felt warm, but nothing like the burning heat of the previous days. "The doctor says you're going to be okay, little one," he whispered to his sleeping daughter. "Papa's here and you're safe now." As the hours passed, Sarah proved to be more than just their rescuer. She seemed to understand instinctively that Standing Wolf was overwhelmed by the hospital environment and helped him navigate everything from finding the cafeteria to understanding the medical terminology the staff used. She also made several phone calls, apparently arranging for his absence from work and ensuring that someone would check on their cabin. "You don't have to stay," Standing Wolf told her during one of her brief absences from the room. "You've already done more than enough." "I want to stay," Sarah replied simply. "At least until we know she's definitely out of danger. Besides, you shouldn't be alone right now." It was an odd situation, Standing Wolf reflected. Here was a woman he had never met before today, who had appeared out of a blizzard like some kind of guardian spirit. And now she was treating him and his daughter as if they were family. In his experience, most white people were polite but distant when dealing with Native Americans. Sarah seemed to see only a father and his sick child, nothing more and nothing less. That evening, Little Dove's fever finally broke completely. She opened her eyes for the first time in 2 days and looked around the hospital room with confusion, but clear recognition. When she saw Standing Wolf, she smiled weakly and tried to speak. "Papa, where are we?" "We're in the hospital, little one," Standing Wolf said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've been very sick, but you're getting better now." Little Dove's eyes moved to Sarah, who was sitting quietly in the corner reading a magazine. "Who is the lady?" "This is Sarah," Standing Wolf explained. "She's a nurse and she helped bring you here when you were sick. She saved your life." Little Dove studied Sarah with the frank curiosity of childhood. "Are you going to be my new mama?" The question hung in the air like a physical presence. Standing Wolf felt his face flush with embarrassment while Sarah looked surprised but not offended. Before either adult could respond, Little Dove continued with the brutal honesty of children. "I asked the spirits to send someone to help Papa. He's been so sad since Mama went to the sky. Maybe they sent you." Sarah moved closer to the bed and smiled gently at Little Dove. "I'm not your new mama, sweetheart, but I am your friend, and I'm very happy that you're feeling better." Standing Wolf was struck by how naturally Sarah interacted with his daughter, neither talking down to her nor being overly familiar. She seemed to understand that children needed honest answers delivered with kindness. Over the next 2 days, as Little Dove continued to recover, Sarah visited regularly. She brought books and small toys, helped with the practical arrangements of extended hospitalization, and somehow made the sterile hospital environment feel less frightening. For both father and daughter, Standing Wolf found himself looking forward to Sarah's visits in a way That had nothing to do with her practical help. There was something about her presence that made him feel less alone in the world, less burdened by the weight of single parenthood and economic struggle. But as Little Dove grew stronger and discharge planning began, Standing Wolf realized that their extraordinary circumstances were coming to an end. Soon they would return to their cabin. Sarah would go back to her normal life, and this strange interlude would become just a memory. On the morning Little Dove was scheduled to be discharged, Standing Wolf woke early in the uncomfortable hospital chair where he had spent the last 3 nights. His daughter was sleeping peacefully. Her color finally returned to normal, her breathing deep and regular. The transformation was almost miraculous compared to the burning, struggling child he had carried through the blizzard just a few days ago. Dr. Chen arrived during morning rounds with good news. Little Dove's blood work showed that the infection was responding well to treatment, and her lungs were clear. She would need to continue taking antibiotics for another week, but she was strong enough to go home. Just make sure she gets plenty of rest and finishes all her medication, Dr. Chen instructed. And bring her back immediately if the fever returns or if she has any difficulty breathing. Standing Wolf nodded, but privately he wondered how he would manage to bring her back if problems arose. His truck was still broken down and he had no money to fix it. The medical bills from this hospitalization would probably take years to pay off. Assuming the hospital would even allow him to set up a payment plan, Sarah arrived just as the discharge paperwork was being completed. She had brought a small stuffed animal for Little Dove, a brown bear wearing a tiny nurse's cap, and helped gather their few belongings. Little Dove was excited about going home but seemed sad about leaving Sarah behind. "Will you come visit us?" Little Dove asked as they prepared to leave. Sarah hesitated, and Standing Wolf felt a stab of disappointment at her obvious reluctance. Of course she wouldn't want to visit their poor cabin on the reservation. She had done her good deed and rescued them from the storm. But that didn't mean she wanted to become involved in their complicated lives. "I don't know where you live," Sarah said carefully. "We live in the old cabin by Willow Creek," Little Dove said eagerly. "Papa says our ancestors built it. There's a big cottonwood tree in the front yard, and we have a garden where we grow corn and beans in the summer." Standing Wolf watched Sarah's face as his daughter described their home with the pride of childhood. The cabin was weathered and small, heated only by a wood stove with running water that sometimes froze in winter. It was nothing like the comfortable life Sarah probably led. But Little Dove made it sound like a palace. "It sounds lovely," Sarah said sincerely, and Standing Wolf realized she meant it. The drive back to the reservation was quiet but not uncomfortable. Sarah had insisted on driving them home, saying she wanted to make sure they were settled safely before the next storm system moved through. Little Dove dozed in the back seat, still recovering her strength, while Standing Wolf gave directions from the passenger seat. When they pulled up to the cabin, Standing Wolf saw it through Sarah's eyes and felt a familiar mixture of pride and embarrassment. The building was old but solid, constructed from logs his grandfather had cut and shaped by hand. The roof needed repair and the front porch sagged slightly, but it had sheltered 3 generations of his family through countless winters. "It's beautiful," Sarah said quietly, and Standing Wolf realized she was looking at the way the afternoon sun caught the weathered logs, at the graceful lines of the old cottonwood tree, at the view across the rolling prairie that stretched to the horizon. Inside, the cabin was cold since the fire had been out for days. Standing Wolf quickly got the wood stove going, while Sarah helped Little Dove settle into her bed. The small space filled with warmth surprisingly quickly, and soon the familiar smell of wood smoke made the place feel like home again. Sarah examined their medicine supplies and made a list of things they would need from the pharmacy. She also noted that their food supplies were running low and that the cabin needed better insulation around the windows to keep the cold out. "I could help with some of these things," she offered hesitantly. Standing Wolf's pride flared immediately. "We don't need charity." "It's not charity," Sarah replied calmly. "It's friendship. Little Dove asked me to visit, remember? Friends help each other." Before Standing Wolf could respond, Little Dove called out from her bed, "Sarah, will you tell me a story before you go?" Sarah looked at Standing Wolf questioningly, and he nodded reluctantly. He listened from the kitchen as Sarah sat beside his daughter's bed and told a gentle story about a brave little girl who helped her father save their village from a terrible winter. Little Dove was asleep before the story ended, but Sarah finished it anyway, her voice soft and soothing in the quiet cabin. When Sarah emerged from the sleeping area, Standing Wolf was making coffee on the small stove. He poured 2 cups and they sat at the wooden table his grandfather had built, looking out at the snow-covered prairie through the small window. "Thank you," Standing Wolf said quietly. "For everything. I don't know how to repay you." "You don't need to repay me," Sarah replied. "I told you this is what friends do." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping coffee and watching the late afternoon light paint the snow in shades of gold and purple. Finally, Sarah spoke again. "I meant what I said about helping with some improvements to the cabin. Not charity, but a practical investment in Little Dove's health. Better insulation, maybe a backup heating source for emergencies." Standing Wolf wanted to refuse, but he thought about his daughter's recent illness and how close they had come to losing everything. His pride was important, but Little Dove's safety was more important. "I can't pay you," he said honestly. "I'm not asking you to pay me," Sarah said. "I'm asking you to let me help. There's a difference." Standing Wolf studied her face, looking for hidden motives or condescension, but found only sincere concern. This woman continued to surprise him. In his experience, most people who offered help expected something in return, even if it was just the satisfaction of feeling superior to those they helped. Sarah seemed to genuinely care about their welfare with no expectation of reward. "Why?" he asked. "Why do you want to help us?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the darkening sky. "I told you I have a daughter," she said finally. "What I didn't tell you is that I haven't seen her in over a year. Her father and I divorced, and he got custody because I travel so much for work. I send money and call when I can, but it's not the same as being there." She paused, her hands wrapped around the warm coffee cup. "When I saw you carrying Little Dove through that storm, risking everything to save her, it reminded me of what real love looks like. I want to help because you're the kind of father I wish I could be as a mother." Standing Wolf felt something shift in his chest, a softening of the defensive walls he had built around his heart. This woman understood the fierce desperation of parental love, because she lived with her own version of it every day. "You can come back," he said quietly, "anytime you want." Little Dove would like that, and he hesitated, then forced himself to be honest. "I would like that too," Sarah smiled. And for the first time since they met, Standing Wolf saw her completely relaxed and genuinely happy. "I'd like that very much." Spring came early that year, melting the snow that had nearly claimed 2 lives and revealing the brown earth beneath. Standing Wolf stood in his garden, preparing the soil for planting, while Little Dove played nearby with her stuffed bear. The child had made a complete recovery from her pneumonia and seemed stronger than ever, her laughter once again filling the cabin with joy. Sarah had kept her promise to visit regularly. At first, her appearances were sporadic, a weekend here, an evening there when her nursing schedule allowed. But gradually her visits became more frequent and longer. She had helped insulate the cabin during the worst of the winter, installed a small backup heater, and ensured they always had adequate food and medical supplies. More importantly, she had become part of their daily lives in ways that went far beyond practical assistance. She helped Little Dove with her reading, taught her card games on long winter evenings, and listened with genuine interest to Standing Wolf's stories about reservation life and Lakota traditions. In return, both father and daughter had opened their hearts to this remarkable woman who had appeared in their darkest hour. Standing Wolf had initially been wary of depending on anyone, especially someone from outside the reservation. His experiences with white people had often been marked by misunderstanding at best, and condescension, or outright prejudice at worst. But Sarah seemed genuinely interested in learning about his culture, asking respectful questions and listening carefully to his answers. She had even begun learning some Lakota words from Little Dove, who delighted in being a teacher. The sight of Sarah struggling with pronunciation while Little Dove giggled and corrected her had become one of Standing Wolf's favorite evening entertainments. As the months passed, Standing Wolf found himself looking forward to Sarah's visits with an anticipation that went beyond friendship. He caught himself thinking about her during his daily activities, wondering what she would think about the deer tracks he found, or the way the sunset painted the sky, or the new wildflowers that appeared each week as spring progressed. Little Dove had no such reservations about expressing her feelings. She had begun referring to Sarah as her almost mama, and frequently asked when Sarah was going to move in with them permanently. Standing Wolf was embarrassed by his daughter's directness, but he couldn't deny that the idea held considerable appeal. One evening in late spring, Sarah arrived with news that changed everything. She had been offered a permanent position at the reservation clinic, providing medical services to the community on a full-time basis. It would mean giving up her traveling nurse assignments and taking a significant pay cut. But it would also mean stability and the chance to make a real difference in people's lives. "I wanted to talk to you about it before I made my decision," Sarah said as they sat on the front porch watching Little Dove chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Standing Wolf felt his heart race with possibilities he had been afraid to consider. "What do you want to do?" "I want to take the job," Sarah said quietly. "But not just because of the work. I want to stay here, with you and Little Dove if you'll have me." The honesty of her words hung in the warm evening air. Standing Wolf had imagined this conversation many times, but now that it was actually happening, he found himself almost afraid to believe it was real. "You know it won't be easy," he said carefully. "Life on the reservation is different from what you're used to. The winters are harsh, money is always tight, and some people won't understand or approve of our relationship." Sarah smiled and reached for his hand. "I've had 8 months to think about all of that. I know exactly what I'm choosing, and I'm choosing it because I love you, both." Little Dove must have sensed the importance of the conversation, because she came running over from her firefly chase and climbed onto the porch. Between them, "Are you going to marry Papa?" she asked Sarah with typical childhood directness. Sarah looked at Standing Wolf with raised eyebrows as if asking permission to answer. Standing Wolf felt a moment of panic, not because he didn't want to marry Sarah, but because he had nothing to offer her in terms of material security or comfort. "I don't have much to give you," he said honestly. "No steady job, no money saved. Just this old cabin and a daughter who thinks you hung the moon. And a man who carried that daughter through a blizzard to save her life," Sarah replied softly. "A man who has taught me what real strength looks like, and what it means to love someone completely. That's not nothing, Standing Wolf, that's everything." Little Dove looked back and forth between the adults, clearly frustrated by their indirect conversation. "So are you getting married or not?" Standing Wolf and Sarah both laughed, and suddenly the tension broke. Standing Wolf realized that he had been making this more complicated than it needed to be. Sarah had proven over and over again that she understood exactly what she was choosing. She loved them. They loved her. And life was too short and too uncertain to worry about anything else. "Yes," he said, looking into Sarah's eyes. "If she'll have us, we're getting married." Little Dove whooped with joy and threw her arms around both adults. "I told you the spirit sent her, Papa. I told you." The wedding took place 3 months later in a ceremony that blended Lakota traditions with Christian elements, reflecting both of their backgrounds. The reception was held in the community center, with food contributed by families from throughout the reservation. Sarah's parents flew in from Vermont, somewhat bewildered by their daughter's choices, but clearly trying to understand and accept her happiness. Standing Wolf's extended family and friends from the reservation embraced Sarah warmly, appreciating both her medical skills and her obvious devotion to Little Dove. The tribal elder who performed the ceremony spoke about how love could bridge any divide, and how the spirit sometimes worked in mysterious ways to bring people together. As Standing Wolf and Sarah danced to an old country song in the community center, Little Dove ran around the edges of the dance floor in her new dress, showing off for anyone who would pay attention. The child had blossomed under Sarah's influence, becoming more confident and outgoing while retaining the gentle spirit that made her so special. "No regrets?" Standing Wolf asked Sarah as they swayed together. "None at all," Sarah replied firmly. "Although I have to admit I never imagined that getting lost in a blizzard would be the best thing that ever happened to me." Standing Wolf pulled his wife closer and looked around at the celebration surrounding them. Little Dove was now teaching Sarah's father some kind of complicated dance that involved a lot of spinning. His new in-laws were deep in conversation with some of the tribal council members. The community that had watched him struggle as a single father was now celebrating his happiness with genuine joy. A year ago, he had been a broken man carrying his dying daughter through a storm, convinced that his world was ending. Tonight he was surrounded by family and friends, married to a woman who had saved them both in ways that went far beyond medical intervention, watching his daughter thrive in ways he had never dared to hope for. Sometimes, Standing Wolf reflected, the spirits really did work in mysterious ways. And sometimes, when a man was desperate enough and the need was great enough, help appeared out of a snowdrift in the form of a woman's gentle touch and fierce determination to save lives. He had learned that love could indeed bridge any divide, and that the strongest foundations were often built on the most unlikely circumstances. As the evening wound down and they prepared to drive home to their cabin, now expanded and winterized properly, Standing Wolf felt a deep sense of gratitude for the storm that had nearly killed them, but had ultimately saved their lives in every way that mattered.